Welcome back to the Junius Maltby channel. We're going to discuss an article I found today titled "Not That There's Any Inflation, But." And we've covered this topic several times in the past, and hopefully we can glean some new things from this article, as times are always changing. But we've talked about people having to move, and expatriatism, people leaving countries and emigrating outside of them because of economic pressures. So I wanted to cover this article real quick and reignite that conversation, see if there's any new thoughts out there that you guys might have. So let's get into it. The numbers are pretty startling. Nearly 7 in 10 Americans have less than $1,000 in savings. 1 out of every 3 Americans has nothing set aside for retirement. And according to Federal Reserve data, the median working age couple has saved just $5,000 for retirement. How is this even possible? How could it be that the citizens of the wealthiest country to have ever existed in the history of the world barely have any savings? Simple. The cost of living has skyrocketed over time. It's become terribly difficult for tens of millions of people to keep up. Just look at the data. Housing prices, once again, are at all-time highs, and for those who choose to rent instead of buy, rents in many cities have also reached all-time highs. This is especially difficult for the millennial generation, which finds itself spending over 40% of their disposable income on housing costs. If you add in student debt, which continues to plague millennials, that takes even more money out of their pockets each month. And God help you if you decide to have children, the cost of which is now at a record level. According to a study published last year by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the overall cost of raising a child from birth to age 21 is now a whopping $233,610. Private studies have pegged that amount even higher, in excess of $300,000. And not that there's any inflation, but child care costs have risen so rapidly that it has become impossible for many families to keep both spouses in their careers. Then there's the cost of insurance and medical care, which continue to soar to record levels. Healthcare costs in the United States are now at the highest levels ever. But even more importantly, the rate at which costs are rising reached their highest level in 32 years. It's no wonder that people aren't able to put any money away, or that, despite a brief dip after the Great Recession, consumer credit is once again exploding. Just like their federal government, Americans are once again heavily indebting themselves. And it's easy to understand why. They just can't make ends meet. The tiny silver lining is that wages have finally started to grow, albeit slightly. But wage growth has been vastly outpaced by the rising costs of major expenses like housing, childcare, insurance, and healthcare. If you find yourself in this situation, struggling without any real sense of security, I'd encourage you to at least consider the out-of-the-box solution. Think about going overseas. And that's where he goes off, and the remainder of the article is his experiences in becoming an expatriate and living outside of the United States, working in other countries, taking up residence in these, what are typically described as utopian beachside communities in South American areas and places like that, places like Bali, Argentina, Chile, you name it. But that's not for everyone. At this point, it's definitely not for me. It's not something that I am comfortable doing. It hasn't gotten to that point yet. But let's talk about it, and as it relates to inflation and how an inflation and these economic troubles seem to push and move people around the planet. We've done, again, I'll remind you, as we just mentioned earlier, the opening of the video, we've done videos and talked about this in the past. We've covered Rome, we've covered people becoming expatriates, and there's a lot of information out there, a lot of different articles and stories and studies and statistics that all cover and talk about these topics from different angles. But you don't have to go as far back as Rome. We have talked about it, but inflation and diluting the currency really disrupted commerce and people buying and selling goods and services and moving about, and it caused a lot of problems with the Roman Empire. And I use that as an example, because at the time it was the biggest, most powerful, wealthiest empire. A lot of people like to compare the United States to the Roman Empire, military expenditures and endeavors, causing the empire to have to spend money and then water down their currency, which led to economic trouble. But the story of inflation and economic hardship has played itself out throughout history. We saw it occur in Europe time and time again. Why did colonists come to America? I found several articles related to that today. I'm not going to cover them in depth. However, there was an economic component to the reason people were motivated to leave their homes and their native lands in Europe and come to this hostile new world. There were economic reasons that drove them here. This new world was a land of opportunity and, capitalism, where people could start off on new ventures and growing sugar, tobacco, cotton. There was so much opportunity. How could they resist it, especially when they were coming from the squalor of urban Europe? I also found a fairly lengthy paper titled "The Europeans, Why They Left and Why It Matters." And of course, part of that discussion was economic. There was a major economic component to people leaving their homelands in Europe and coming to the New World. Now, I'm not saying things have gotten as bad as 16th and 17th century Europe here in the United States. However, could it get to that point? And if it did, or if you knew at this point in time that certain hardships were around the corner, what would it take for you to pick up and move on? You got to try to put yourself in their shoes and think that these people abandoned all that they knew, all that they had, in order to go to a new place for a new opportunity. So it had to be pretty bad where they were. Now, none of us know the future. Nobody can pretend to know the future. Nobody can guarantee that they know the future. A lot of people try to act like they do. The media tries to act like they have some form of an idea. But as we've seen, nobody can predict what the stock market is going to do, what an election is going to look like, how it's going to turn out, what the results will be. There's no way to guarantee what tomorrow will bring. So the only question we can ask ourselves then is there a possibility of this happening in the United States, in these Western countries? Because we're not the only ones here in the U.S. England, France, the EU, the Euro, is facing similar financial problems and hardships. We're spending too much. The currencies are going to have to suffer the consequences of gross negligence, major debt. These nations are left with very little options. They can either default on the debt, say we're not going to pay it, tax the people directly, jack taxes up to 80%, which I don't see that happening, or hide it through the inflation tax and just inflate the money supply, destroying the currency that the citizens use, and over time driving the costs of goods and services through the roof and destroying people's quality of life. That's the most likely scenario that I see occurring out of this, and it's been done time and time again. It's right out of their playbook. So once we accept that that's most likely going to happen, it's the highest probability, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what do we plan on doing about it? How are we prepared to deal with the inevitable inflation and destruction of the very currencies we are forced to use in day-to-day life? Because we have to agree that this is coming, that there is inflation coming. We're seeing it mentioned in the news daily now. It's popping up everywhere you look, in financial articles, news outlets. You're seeing the words inflation, inflation. It's starting out slow, but it's pulsating. It's out there. Eventually, it's going to become much more common knowledge, and it's going to be much more obvious to a larger swath of the population. Now, as people prepare and brace for it, you're going to see certain items, as we've discussed in the past, disappear from the marketplace. And those items that I think are going to be on the top of that list of things to disappear first will be precious metals, or they'll be priced out of your ability to get them. And as we've often seen repeated, precious metals are the best way to prepare for these currency destructions, these inflation scenarios. The author of that first article that we covered, he called it Plan B, having a Plan B. And I don't know what his Plan A is, but my Plan A, or I think the best Plan A, is precious metals at first. Would be to prepare for the inflation, the hyperinflationary event, by stashing as much of your wealth away in precious metals in preparation for that type of event. Now the timeline on this, difficult. Like I said, nobody knows the future. I have no idea. This could be, what are we looking at here? This could be 2025, 2030, 2035, 2040. What year, when is 0 hour with the US dollar? When is the 0 hour with the euro? Well, that's, I think, a lot sooner. That could be within the next 5 years. I think the euro's gone. But US dollar, I think, has a little bit more time left than that. But if you are in euros, I don't see that currency existing that much longer. And I don't know what the fallout will be. I don't know how they're going to sweep that mess up. I guess in summary, inflation's happening. We know that. We agree on that. And, well, the best way to prepare for that is either get some precious metals and prepare yourself in every way that you can where you are, kind of hold tight, shelter in place, or consider relocation to other places. Now that, to me, one of the reasons I guess I don't like that idea is it comes with other risks. When you leave these Western nations for other not as westernized nations where it's a little bit more, let's say, unstable, where there's not as much common law, English common law, and respect for, let's say, private property rights or outsiders owning property and title and deed. I don't know what that's like. If you buy a place or you have a house in some of these other places. I do have friends that own places in like the Philippines and in South America and in Mexico, and it can be different. There can be, you hear stories of times where you can't own land in a certain area unless, like for example the Philippines, unless you are married to a native, a national there. And that's how they got in, as one of their family members, his son, married a Filipino girl, and they own some land in the Philippines. They built a house, and they have a nice place there. And it's very affordable compared to here. They built their house for $5,000 pretty much on beachfront in a very nice little Filipino community. I've got friends that have a place in Mexico, cost of living a fraction of what it is here. Now, when you look at like South America and Mexico, is there hostilities for outsiders, for Westerners that are buying places there on the cheap? I don't know. I'm sure that there could be a time in the future where it's frowned upon, and I don't know how protected those Westerners will be should a majority of that population down there wish to reject these outsiders owning land and these outsiders living with a higher standard of living than a majority of the surrounding population. There can be hostilities there, and those hostilities can turn pretty violent. I tend to be comfortable here in a westernized culture, and I tend to feel safer in an area where I share, in a country that I've grown accustomed to, that I grew up in, that I know very well. It would take a lot of difficulty and a lot of economic hardship to drive me from, well, the land where I was born, the nation I was born in. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm sure there is a scenario out there and a set of circumstances that could drive me from the United States, but at this point, it's just not likely. So I don't know where you guys are at. What circumstances would have to take place in your life to get you to look at emigrating, leaving, migrating? What would it take for you to have to leave? And what are you doing aside from preparing with precious metals for an inflationary type event, or an economic meltdown as they call it? Alright, thanks for being part of this conversation today on the Junius Maltby channel. Keep stacking silver, keep stacking your gold, get out of fiat paper.